Hi there, my name's Craig and I'm here at Colonial Michilimackinac in Mackinaw City. And you may not have noticed it, but over the past few years we've actually been working pretty diligently to get reproductions of all of the garrison artillery that would have been here at the fort back in the 1770s, which is the time period that we're interpreting when you come to visit us today. Now, we're very fortunate because the British military kept pretty good records of the artillery pieces that were at Michilimackinac at that time. So, for instance, we have ordnance returns from both 1778 and 1779, basically just lists of all the heavy weapons that the British military was maintaining here at Michilimackinac. And we've been pretty successful in acquiring reproduction pieces to further that part of our interpretation of Michilimackinac in the 1770s. Now, this weapon that is in front of me right here is a 6-pound garrison gun, and we know in the 1770s that there were 2 of these weapons mounted here. Now, this weapon, as you might be able to see, is rather large. It's mounted on this gray carriage with relatively small wheels, and this is a garrison carriage. It's designed for use in a fort, so basically exactly as you see it mounted right now. It is movable, you can move it back and forth, but it's really not designed to be moved long distances. Again, that carriage has relatively small wheels. It's relatively similar to a naval gun carriage. Really the only difference would be that if this were aboard a ship, those wheels would be made out of wood and not metal as they are right here. But that's okay. This weapon is not designed to move very far. I also mentioned that it's a 6-pound gun. That refers to the type of ammunition it's intended to fire. A 6-pound gun fires a cannonball that weighs 6 pounds. So you can see the cannonball right here. It's actually quite small. It's about 3.5 inches in diameter, maybe the size of a softball. And this is actually a piece of fixed ammunition. So that cannonball is strapped directly to a wooden sabot with some tin strips, and then on the back end of it there's a powder bag containing about 1.5 pounds of gunpowder. And that's one option for firing out of a garrison gun like this. Probably more likely in a garrison situation they'd be using unfixed ammunition, so they'd load the powder separately and then a sabot and then a ball on top of it. But again, just keep in mind that guns at this time, cannons at this time, took their name from the weight of the projectile that they fired. Now, as we'll see in a little while, there were other 6-pound guns here that looked very different from this piece. As I mentioned, being a garrison gun, this is not intended to move long distances, and as a result, this can actually be made out of iron. And iron would have been ideal for the construction of garrison guns for a couple of reasons. One, it's pretty cheap. Especially compared to some of the other materials we'll talk about in a little while. So these are relatively cheap to make. However, iron is very brittle. It doesn't always stand up so well to the stresses and the forces of the explosions that would be taking place inside this gun barrel. And as a result, to make this safe for the soldiers who would have been manning it, there needed to be a lot more material in this gun barrel. So it had to be quite large, it had to be pretty bulky, there'd be a lot of iron in this barrel, and as a result, this is a pretty heavy piece of equipment. Again, it's on this carriage that is not designed to move long distances. The barrel also does not contribute to its mobility, again, because it's quite heavy, because you need so much iron in a barrel like this to make it safe to use. So you've got something that is pretty heavy but pretty cheap. And again, that's why it's ideal for this garrison application, something where you could move it in and out of batteries, so you move it up to a firing port like we've got here, maybe roll it back to load it up, but you're not going to be hauling a gun like this cross country. And again, we know that the British military maintained 2 weapons like this here at Michilimackinac. We're unsure of where exactly they would have been positioned, probably up on a platform somewhere on the walls. We actually have our 2 weapons today, our 2 reproduction weapons, mounted above the 2 fort gates. They may have done that. And we do know that they were probably up on the walls somewhere, because in the mid-1770s, the commanding officer here, a man named Arent de Peyster, actually complained that those gun platforms had gone so rotten that he was afraid that they could no longer support the weight of these guns. So if there were 2 of these iron garrison guns here at Michilimackinac back in the 1770s, let's take a closer look at the other 9 pieces of ordnance that British soldiers would have been responsible for. Now, if those heavy iron 6-pound guns that we've got mounted up above the gates are essentially the biggest pieces of ordnance here at Michilimackinac in the 1770s, this weapon is one of the smallest. This is called a wall gun, and thanks to those ordnance returns, we know that there were 2 of these weapons here in the late 1770s. Now, as you take a closer look at this weapon, you can probably see that it is very similar to a soldier's musket. It's just a whole lot bigger. It works in the exact same way. It's a flintlock weapon, so the lock down here has a piece of flint and a piece of steel that strike one another to generate sparks to begin the ignition sequence. But the weapon is over 6 feet tall. It weighs about 35 pounds, and this barrel is 98 caliber, so it's nearly a full inch in diameter. This is intended to fire something perhaps the size of a golf ball or a ping pong ball. Now, these weapons, as their name implies, are intended to be fired from a rest, resting upon a wall, or perhaps upon the gunwale of a boat or a ship. And in fact, some wall pieces would actually have been fitted with a yoke. It would look very similar to an oarlock on a rowboat, and that yoke could just slip easily into prepared positions, into prepared holes drilled upon the wall, so it would take some of the weight of this piece. Although it is big and bulky, it still is lightweight enough that a single soldier could move it around. And these pieces were primarily intended for defense, so defending someplace like Michilimackinac. These are considered especially useful in a siege situation. If there was an enemy outside the walls here, digging trenches towards the walls of the fort, trying to undermine them, this weapon could be used to punch through some of the protective barriers that the enemy engineers and sappers would have been using. Again, firing a very large, essentially musket ball, it could punch through whatever those enemy soldiers were working behind and convince them to maybe stop trying to directly attack the walls of the fort. And again, since it is man-portable, since one person can just pick it up and move it around, it could be brought to bear with relative ease, unlike those heavy 6-pound guns, which, while they are mobile, it takes a while to get them into position. This, a single soldier can pick up and move wherever it would be needed. Now, in the 1770s, there were different proposals put forth to how to actually employ these here at Michilimackinac. Early on in the 1770s, there was some discussion about actually building a detached blockhouse or some sort of advanced fortification out on the south side of the fort. And the plans called for that advanced fortification to be armed with a couple of wall pieces. And beginning in 1779 through 1780, that advanced fortification was actually built out here on the southwest side of the fort, specifically to defend a rise in the ground that they simply could not get rid of. We don't know what type of weapons would have been mounted in that position specifically, but given the earlier idea to actually use these wall pieces, it's a pretty good bet that that's where they may have ended up if this place were ever actually attacked. So if we've gone from essentially the biggest to the smallest weapons in Michilimackinac arsenal, let's continue our tour of the artillery here at the fort and see what else the British soldiers had at their disposal. So one of the more interesting pieces of ordnance that would have been mounted here at Michilimackinac was called an amusette. Sometimes you'll also see that word spelt with a B, so it would be ambusette. But we know that there were 4 of those weapons here, again, thanks to those ordnance returns from the late 1770s. We know that they were bronze, and we also know that they were mounted on garrison carriages, just like those heavy iron 6-pound guns that we've got mounted above our gates. Now, an amusette is kind of an interesting weapon. It's designed to fire a projectile that weighs perhaps half a pound, so it'd be a relatively small projectile. But amusettes in the 18th century could actually take on one of 2 different forms. One would be a kind of just a small bronze cannon, which is, again, how we've chosen to interpret it based on the fact that, again, we know they were bronze, we know they were mounted on garrison carriages here. The other version of an amusette would be a massive, truly a super-sized musket. If that wall gun is like a large version of a musket, an amusette, in at least this form, would have been much, much larger. It would have had a barrel perhaps 9 feet long, perhaps mounted on a cart, and usually it would have been served by a crew of maybe 2 soldiers. Again, we've chosen to interpret it this way because of the few notes that we actually have from those ordnance returns, that it probably was the cannon variant rather than that extra large musket variant. Now, about the only other thing that we know about the amusettes here at Michilimackinac, again, thanks to those ordnance returns, and specifically thanks to Arent de Peyster writing just a little bit about them, he said that they were old and essentially worn out. He specifically said that the vents were blown, that they were worn out, that they were really not useful anymore. And what he's referring to with the vents is essentially the touch hole where you actually set these things off. Those could wear out over time. There were ways to repair them, but apparently that was not happening here at Michilimackinac. And as a result of that wear and tear, de Peyster said that the amusettes were good only for saluting. So he never intended to actually load a projectile into these weapons and attempt to shoot it at anyone. Instead, the soldiers would have used those weapons with blank rounds just to make some noise. And we do know that cannon salutes and artillery salutes were fired pretty regularly here, really whenever anyone important came to visit, as a mark of respect. So that's probably what those amusettes ended up being used for in the 1770s. But with that, let's continue our tour and take a look at some other pieces of the garrison artillery. Now, as we continue our tour of Michilimackinac artillery, something that's kind of important to remember is that most of those weapons were general purpose. They could be used either for offense or defense, depending on what the situation called for. But this weapon right here had a pretty specific role to play. And this is the only weapon that we're aware of that had a specific role here at the fort, and it was to help bolster the defenses of the fort. So this would not have been used offensively here at Michilimackinac, although it certainly could have been. We know that this weapon was here specifically to help defend the fort from outside attacks. Now, this is a 4 1/4 inch mortar, also sometimes called a Coehorn mortar, after the Dutch military engineer who invented this style of weapon. And this is the smallest type of mortar that the British military was using in the 18th century. Now, a mortar is fundamentally different from a cannon, which are the other pieces that we've been looking at thus far. As you can see, this has a very short barrel. It's maybe a foot and a half long, and that barrel is at a fixed 45-degree angle. That means that this is not a long-range weapon. It's not going to fire projectiles very far horizontally. Instead, it's going to fire them way up in the air vertically in a high arc. And that's ideal for use in attacking someplace like Michilimackinac. This style of weapon is actually invented specifically for siege warfare, because 2 or 3 soldiers could drag one of these things around pretty easily in a trench and then lob projectiles over the walls of some sort of enemy fortification. But again, they're not doing that here at Michilimackinac. Why would the British have something primarily useful in sieges at a place like Michilimackinac, where there's no place to besiege for several hundred miles? We're fortunate that in 1769, the commanding officer here actually wrote a letter that gives us a clue as to not only where the weapon would have been located at the fort, but also what it was used for. And again, because this weapon is designed to fire a projectile in a high arc, it can clear obstacles. And when you're here at Michilimackinac today, it can be difficult to visualize this. But back in the 1770s, the fort was not surrounded by nice trees and vacation cottages and the rest of Mackinaw City like it is today. Instead, it was surrounded by a pretty large sandy plain. All the trees had been cut down for use as fuel or as building material. And instead, there were just sand dunes, especially out to the west side of the fort. And on windy days, especially like today, that sand kind of blows around. The sand dunes would actually migrate over time. And in that letter from 1769, the commanding officer said that there was a dune out to the west of the fort that was so large that it didn't matter how often he sent soldiers out there with spades and shovels to try and remove it. They simply could not get rid of that dune, and that meant that there was a place where an enemy could take cover. In that same letter, he said that there could be several hundred enemy soldiers behind that dune within 40 or 50 yards of the fort wall, and the soldiers here inside the fort would have no idea that they were there. much less be able to shoot at them directly with their muskets or with those cannons. That's where the mortar comes into play. Since it's not trying to shoot straight at the enemy, instead it's trying to drop something down upon their heads, this would have been specifically used to defend that west side of the fort. Because again, by dropping that projectile up and over behind that dune, the defenders here at Michilimackinac could bring that enemy force under fire relatively easily. Something else that's pretty interesting about this mortar, this is the only piece of artillery here at Michilimackinac that would fire a projectile that actually exploded. We talked about the 6-pound cannonballs that the 6-pound guns would fire. Those are 6 pounds of solid metal, and that will do a great deal of damage against the hull of an enemy warship, against fortifications, against a wall like the one that we've got here at Michilimackinac. It also does a great deal of damage if you fire it into a mass of people, into a mass of enemy troops, but it doesn't actually explode. It's just 6 pounds of solid metal. A mortar is designed to fire a shell, and that shell would be just a hollow sphere of iron, and on the inside there would be gunpowder. They wouldn't put extra musket balls or anything like that inside there to create extra shrapnel or anything. Instead, they just relied upon the explosive force of that gunpowder shattering that iron shell to create fragments that would cause a great deal of damage to people or things within the blast radius. And again, as a 4 1/4 inch mortar, this is designed to fire a shell that is 4 1/4 inches in diameter. So it's a relatively large ball. It's larger than those 6-pound balls. There would be a fuse that the artilleryman would insert into that shell. That fuse would be ignited from the lifting charge, which actually would not be very big. You didn't need a whole lot of gunpowder to actually fire one of these things. That gunpowder would be very tightly packed into a small chamber here at the base of the barrel. That shell then placed on top of it. And when that main charge was ignited, that would ignite that fuse, which would then burn through the air as the shell flew. And ideally, the artilleryman wanted that fuse to burn down, to get down into the center of that shell where the rest of that gunpowder was, when it was about 6 feet off the ground. That was kind of the ideal height to cause maximum damage. Again, we know that shells were stored up on the bastions. Those ordnance returns specifically say that. So combined with that letter from 1769, we're almost certain that this mortar would have been mounted somewhere on the west side of the fort, again, specifically to counter the threat from that large sand dune. So although this mortar had a very specific role here at Michilimackinac, again, the other artillery pieces were more general purpose. So let's continue our tour and take a look at some of the other weapons that soldiers had available to them back in the 1770s. So we'll wrap up our tour of Michilimackinac artillery with actually the first piece that you see as you approach the fort from the visitor center. This is a light 6-pound field gun. Now, historically, there would have been 2 of these weapons here at Michilimackinac, and we know from some other records that they were usually parked inside on the parade ground. Now, just like those heavy iron 6-pound guns that we started our tour with, this weapon is also designed to fire a 6-pound cannonball. So it's essentially the same caliber of gun, but it's substantially smaller. And that's because this piece, along with some of the other weapons that we've been looking at, is made out of bronze. Back in the 18th century, they actually used the terms bronze and brass interchangeably, but it's actually made out of bronze. And bronze in the 18th century was more expensive, definitely more expensive than iron, but it does have some definite advantages. One, it's a bit stronger than iron. It's not as brittle, so it's not as prone to failure. If a bronze gun fails, it doesn't just catastrophically explode like an iron gun might. It will just kind of start to deform and bend. And it's more lightweight. You can get more strength out of less material with bronze. So you don't need as much material built up around the barrel to withstand the forces of firing like you do with iron, and that makes bronze ideal for casting the barrel for field guns, weapons that are supposed to be highly mobile, things that are supposed to move around easily. And that bronze barrel is mounted here on a traveling carriage. Now, this style of carriage in particular was a slight improvement over an earlier variant. This particular style was introduced in 1776. But field carriages in general have these very large wheels. They make it easy to move around on the battlefield. Just a few people can actually haul this into firing position. For longer distance travel, there might be a limber, essentially another two-wheeled cart that this gun could hook onto, and then that limber would be harnessed to a horse. But in combat and for short distance moves, people could move this thing around. There would be 15 to 16 artillerymen assigned as crew members for a gun of this size, and several of those soldiers, their only job would be to actually move this thing around on the battlefield. They might be wearing harnesses that they could attach to this, or there were ropes that they could pull on to move this thing around. And again, it's designed to be a mobile weapon system. It's also supposed to be a self-contained weapon system. This traveling carriage has ammunition lockers on either side of the barrel. Those would be where the ammunition would be stored, so the cannonballs, the gunpowder that we talked about. This weapon would also be probably carrying a second type of ammunition called case shot. That's essentially a large tin can full of large musket balls, and that turns this weapon into a giant shotgun. If those cannonballs are more useful at long range against hardened targets, again like a wall or the hull of a warship, that case shot is much more an anti-personnel round. It doesn't have as much range to it, but if enemy troops are closing in on an artillery position, the artillerymen could switch to case shot to try and keep them away. Now, again, this weapon would have been stored inside the fort on a regular basis, and it could have been moved around as needed, again, thanks to the design of the carriage that it is sitting upon. Now, this weapon, again, one of the first things that you see as you enter the site, we do actually fire this gun on a daily basis for demonstration. We also fire the mortar on a daily basis for demonstration. Occasionally, we will also fire the wall gun if conditions are right. So you do get a chance to actually see these weapons in action and see how the soldiers here at Michilimackinac would have been using them back in the 1770s. Now, with that, hope you've enjoyed our brief look at the artillery pieces here at Michilimackinac. Again, I'd invite you to come visit us here at Colonial Michilimackinac in Mackinaw City so you can see these weapons for yourself, so you can see them demonstrated and see everything else that we have here at the fort. Again, hope to see you here at Colonial Michilimackinac sometime soon.